Okay. So our topic for today, excuse me, our topic for today is paraphrasing and reflecting. And I kind of want to differentiate the two because they sound very similar to one another, and even the reasons why we do both of these, it has kind of the same goal. When we're paraphrasing, we're summarizing what we have learned in our own words as counselors or facilitators. Usually, this is done either at the end of a group or halfway, or whenever you're making a transition or understanding something. So, for example, if you start with process at the beginning of the group, meaning that you go around and you ask how everyone is doing, if they've had any challenges or successes in that week, and you go around and at the end you kind of paraphrase the common themes that you heard when everybody was doing their check-in. Um, Also, we paraphrase at the end of group to kind of recap what we've gone over and the general phrases and everything, phrases and information we've gone over and what some of the highlights of the evening were. And then you transition to go, and since we've done this, this is what we're going to go into next week when we meet again. Okay. Reflecting is when you're taking one specific person. So this isn't a group, this is an individual, and they tell a story. And this is kind of a check for accuracy because what you do in this situation is basically say, so what I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I heard you say. And you tell them, you reflect back to them the story that you heard, and then you provide the opportunity for them to correct anything or to fill in the gaps. Both of these have the goal of showing that the client is being heard or that the group was heard as a whole, in paraphrasing as an example, or an individual knows that you understand um, what they're going through and what their story is. Okay. And so just to kind of recap on phrasing, this is they use the term reflect about the key points about the client story in the group, the key points of what you processed in the group. It is sometimes called holding up the mirror to the client so that they can hear the words repeated back to them. In the group setting, it's about letting the group as a whole understand the journey that they're all going through. Okay. And this really provides three functions. And really in the group setting, this really comes home, is it lets the client know that you're paying attention or that you're hearing them, that you're just not sitting there for example, in the group, just kind of floating from topic to topic and kind of partly listening and partly not. It shows your group members that you are fully engaged with them and a part of their journey. The client can be sure that they have listened and gives the opportunity to correct or add information. So when doing paraphrasing, you do want to do kind of what we did with reflection and kind of say at the end of the group, for example, is there anything that I'm missing that we've gone over today or what we've experienced today? And you let the group members kind of fill in those gaps. Okay. And it gives opportunity for client to hear the power of their own words. So again, in paraphrasing, you're kind of using your own language, but they learn that, hey, my words have meaning to this individual. They're basically paraphrasing back what we went through today and what we processed. So it gives them power and ownership that what they say, for example, in the group setting, is going to be heard and recognized. Okay. So this is paraphrasing. And again, reflection and paraphrasing are going to sound very similar together. but they have two kind of different purposes in the group setting. In the group setting, this is allowing all your group members to hear what's going on. It's a general um, process. In the individual counseling session, you usually use paraphrasing at the end of the session to kind of review what you and your client have gone through in that journey of 50 or 60 minutes. And then again, you give them the opportunity to kind of say, is there anything I missed or we're missing from what we talked about today? And you allow the client again to fill in those gaps if there's any gaps in it. Okay. And then we have reflecting. Okay. And to kind of again give a definition of this to kind of make it clear. Reflecting is meant to show the client that you have heard not only what is being said, but also what feelings and emotions the client is experiencing when sharing their story with you. Okay. This is sometimes known in counseling speak as the music behind the words. So, one of the things with paraphrasing is you're just really kind of giving back um, the themes and all of these. The trick about reflecting is not only do you want to make sure you have the client's story correct and you're being heard, but you want to add in the emotions uh, that are being conveyed. For example, you could be saying, I noticed when you were talking about your brother, you were really choking up and tearful. Is that a common emotion you feel when you think about what happened between you and your brother? So not only do you tell the story, and I don't know what the story is, I can't make this one up on the fly, but maybe it's a story about something they went through together in childhood. Okay. And then you notice while they're telling the story, they start getting teary and choked up. You want to in your reflection, you want to reflect that back to them. Okay. Reflection is a part of rapport building as well. So kind of rewinding the clock, rewinding the time back to rapport. Reflecting is a good way of continuing the process of rapport building. Okay. Because what you're doing again is reflecting the key points of a client's story. And it's sometimes described again. This is just like the paraphrasing. This is where those two kind of intermix. It's about holding that mirror up to the client again. But with reflection, you want to be more specific. You kind of want to match their words and their language instead of putting it in, psychological jargon or in your own words that you use. When you're doing paraphrasing, you can do some of that. With reflection, you really want to match kind of how the client told the story, the language that they used. This skill provides two functions. It lets the client know that you're paying attention and that you're hearing. And it assures the client that you have listened and given the opportunity to correct or add information. Like I said, usually the way I've always began a reflection is this is what I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. And again, this skill you want to put in the terminology that your client hears because you really want to give them the power to really hear their own words, to hear how they kind of in a sense sound and understand their world. Okay. So in reflection, you kind of want to be more like a recording device, if you want to put it in this analogy. The only difference is in the recording, you do want to stop once in a while and say, for the example I gave, I noticed when you choked up and teared up when you were telling me that story about your brother, that example that I gave. So it is a lot of your tape recording, but a lot of it is also integrating those feelings and emotions that you observe from your client as they tell you that story. Okay. So these are some main kind of bullet points just to kind of go over. Reflection again is holding up that mirror, repeating what the client says for almost exactly as you heard it. Okay. And this is kind of the skill behind this. And I know I remember in earlier class, some of you actually remarked that you've been practicing this with people you know. I believe there was a story of the sister who was going through difficult times. Um, and I would encourage you again, find that person that you just openly say, I'm practicing the skill, um, and I need you to help me with it. Because the goal of this skill is in the beginning, it sounds artificial when you say, when you just simply say, this is what I heard, correct me if I'm wrong. But the more and more natural you make that sound and it becomes part of your process of communicating with other people, the less it sounds like you're just counseling or doing one of your counseling tricks on everyone. Or I know when I've been unauthentic about asking clients, they kind of say, they assume that I'm manipulating them in some way. So I would encourage you to practice with this one, who's safe, that you can do this with over and over and over, and until it becomes natural, until it becomes part of your natural language and the words you use. Okay. You might reflect back in whole sentences, or you might select a few words, or even a single word from the client has brought up. In this type of reflection, this is where you want to kind of, when you reflect on, for example, a single word or maybe a couple words, it's when your client is saying something that they usually they don't use. Okay. So, if you're thinking about, maybe they're processing um, some emotional state, let's say, and maybe some of their trauma. Let's use trauma as an example. And they're telling their story of trauma, and they happen to say something like, mm, maybe something like it hurts them when they think of this um, daily. It's a poor example. I apologize. But they've never used that. They haven't expressed that they experience hurt on a daily basis. This is where once they tell the story, you can say, something you brought up that I don't think we've talked about is when you say that you think about this and it hurts you on a daily basis. And you haven't ever mentioned that before. Can we process that a little bit more? And so usually, again, reflection is when you're reflecting the entire story in whole sentences in their language. But once in a while, if the client brings something up that they usually don't, then you kind of may just want to go back and clarify. In fact, in a lot of the literature, if you read any counseling books, this is actually called clarification, not necessarily reflection, where you're just clarifying on some terms or some unusual things or out of the normal things that are being stated. Okay. Uh, Reflection is also known as being more and more known as the lost skill, because when watching counseling students doing simulated skill sessions or listening to the recording from placements, where clients, of course, have consent, we seldom see reflection being used as a skill. Um, And it's really a shame because this can be one of your most powerful allies, when one, building that rapport, but making sure that you have the story as the provider and the client understands their story as it's being heard. Okay. When we use a skill, and again, we want to match the tone, the feeling of words. You bring up the client's facial expressions and body language. You really want to let them see that mirror, um, and understand it. So, uh, for example, this is the example they use. You might hunched their shoulder as they said, "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." And you can reflect back to them, "I felt so scared. I didn't know what to do," using their same body language. And you can kind of say something like, "I'm wondering what this meant. And I want you to watch me and just hear these words back. And you go ahead and hunch and say, 'You stated, I felt scared. I felt so scared. I didn't know what to do.' What did your body language spoke a lot of words or a lot of emotions in that. What was that making you feel? What were you going through in that moment when you did that body language?" And sometimes they'll say, "I don't know." Um, and this is where, if dependent upon the type of therapist you consider yourself, you can say, "Well, let's explore that more. What do you think it meant?" And you can kind of challenge them on that. Or if you're more of a kind of that more cognitive behavioral approach, you can kind of say, "Well, for a lot of people, or what we know about hunching behavior, this is what it could mean. Does that resonate with you?" Okay, that's more of a direct approach. And the other approach is actually helping the client explore um, that behavior itself. Okay. Either approach works, but what you want the client to know, really depended upon, undifferentiated from the explanation that is provided, you want the client to be aware that they're making those behaviors when they're explaining certain things, because sometimes we don't realize how much something has affected us or the meaning of certain things. And so we want to reflect that back to them and let them know kind of how they are coming across, if you want to put it that way. Okay. So I am going to kind of stop here. And I'm going to leave this recording, and I'm not going to unshare the screen. But I want to go back before we go into these other skills. And I want you all to think back. We did silence a lot. And I want to go back to rapport building. And you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. What I'm curious about is just going back. Does anybody have any questions about the topic of rapport building?
No questions.
I see Isabel has her hand up. Thank you, Rachel. Isabel?
So when you have a client and when, like, let's say they're court ordered versus voluntarily seeking the help, how do you get them to engage and to be able to share those things with you? And like it, let's just say like it's a client that's going to be really hard to break through. So how would you kind of rephrase our paragraph, the session that much really didn't happen? Like what would be a good skill to kind of maneuver through that?
Okay, so if I'm understanding your question right, you're curious about when you're working with individuals that, one, have to be there because of some court thing, they were ordered there, and they don't want to be there. Is that kind of the
Yes,
example you're providing?
yes,
And
and they're
so,
not engaging. So how would you like Like, what would you say? Like, maybe like, would it be something like, well, we can try next session, or like, I noticed that, you weren't really interested in, like, what would be the most appropriate thing to say without saying like, well, this didn't happen much in the session. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, so well, first of all, it's not abnormal for someone to be resistant. And we'll talk about this more um, probably starting next week, how to deal with a resistant client. Um, but the kind of to the short answer of at this point, I'll say, and we'll get into it more, I promise, a little later on, is that with resistant clients, you always have to provide them with their choices. Okay. Even with a court-ordered person, they have the choice to be there or not. And reminding them of that is important. Okay. Usually with court-ordered individuals, the thing is they're looking for that, how many weeks I have to do this, right? So, anger management, they might order to 24 sessions and they mark them off each week and they don't talk at all during the whole 24 weeks. And then you write a report to the court usually saying whether or not they completed or not. And usually you can say, well, they completed the 24 session, but it's unknown whether or not they actually learned anything or if it benefited them in any way because they just showed up. And it's important to let clients know that not only do they need to show up to the session, but they have to be engaged in the session. But they have the choice to be there or not. So if they're not going to be engaged, they'd be just better off just telling their probation officer, I'm not coming. That's a direct method. Okay. And it really depends on how you read the individual, because with individuals that are just really hard, I don't want to be here, using those very direct and blunt statements is a method. Okay. For other individuals, like people who are dealing with addiction and they don't think they have an addiction, those types of things. It's really getting them involved in the group process. So one of the things that I usually do in that kind of situation is a person will, say something, a skill they used, and maybe it failed. Directly asking the resistant individual, well, what do you think, John? What do you think could have happened differently in this situation, or can you relate to this? So finding ways to kind of, if you want to call it this, call them out on their despondency. Okay. But I'm going to leave that for right now because we are going to spend probably 2 classes talking about the resistant client, if that's okay.
thank you. That reassures me. It was just one of my worries because you made it seem like every client was going to be easy up until, but now I understand we're getting to that phase later. So thank you for the short end.
You're welcome. And no, no, one thing we have to realize is that while it's becoming more and more acceptable to go to counseling and therapy, and it's becoming more and more accepted, um, people still have some biases and ideas about what counseling and group work is. And so even though it's becoming more and more acceptable, it's still a challenge to get any client really to open up and to be fully engaged. So yes, be aware that this is not simple work. Okay, any other questions on the rapport building end? Okay. Thank you, Jocelyn. Okay. So let's go forward And I know we spent a lot of time on this topic. Is there any questions or comment about the utilization of silence? All right, thank you, Fladina. All right, not hearing any on that. All right, with that being said, is there any questions or comment on both paraphrasing and reflection? Is there any questions on those? Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Lindy. All right, thank you, Tashina. All right. So what I want to spend the rest of class doing is I want to talk about some important skills. We're not going to get into them as much detail as we did with rapport and silence and reflection and paraphrasing, because those are skills that you need to generalize across cases. The next ones are general skills that you'll want to develop, but you'll utilize them given the situation, which I'll get into. So um, the first one is course focusing. Okay. Um, this is a useful skill if clients bring up lots of issues to a session. Okay. So this is when you really want to use this skill when there's a lot of things that are coming up. And by asking the client which issues is most pressing. Okay. The counselor and the client have a clear understanding of what is being worked with. Usually, when the major issue is the focus of the work, other than issues tend to fade away. Okay. So, this skill is usually when the client comes in and they're just saying, I dealt with this, and maybe they list off like 10 things that they're dealing with. Okay. And you know that you don't have time to get through all 10 of those. And so you ask the client directly, what three are the most significant to you, for example? Or what two? I really wouldn't recommend going over three if there's a list of 10 or even 20, because three issues tend to be about what you can get through within a session. Okay. Um, this is really common, especially during the first session. When a client comes in, you go through the informed consent and you say to them, you can tell me anything you want, and it won't go beyond these four walls, with the exceptions we talked about in the disclosure. But anything outside of those things, you can tell me. And a lot of times, and I'll say this again, especially when you've started to build rapport from the beginning, you'll get what sometimes, I know this is a crude term, you get the verbal throw up where they just start cathartically just letting everything go. Okay. There's two things with that. One, you're doing your job right if you get that response. Two, um, now your job is to focus. Okay. Um, and one of the things to do in this situation, and the thing is you can kind of, if you want, you could put kind of the blame on yourself for not being able to address all their issues. You can kind of say, you know, you're telling me a lot of stuff right now. And I'm just wondering, maybe we should just focus on maybe three of these for today. And then we can move on as we move across. But the issue is you don't want to do this as an interruption. You don't want to say, okay, hold on, slow down. You want to look for a natural break when they're pouring out all of these things that they're going through. And you want to say, okay, let's hold on just a second. I'm hearing a lot of things going on. Um, from what you've just told me, and we'll get to all of the other issues as we move along, what are probably the most three significant issues? Okay. And by doing this, what you'll find is by having the client focus on those three, they tend to alleviate a lot of the symptomology that is dealing with a lot of the other things that they wanted to talk about. Okay. And you'll actually, usually, what you'll see is by it kind of has a trickle down effect in focusing on the three main ones. Okay. But then it also gives you the opportunity as the therapist or the group facilitator to really start to understand the individual. It gets you to know them and what they really want to focus on and really want to understand. Okay. And so focusing again is a skill when you're just getting the list of problems is getting out of control, as you would say, and you want to bring focus back to the session. Okay. So that's a skill that is used when the client has a lot of issues coming in and you want to make sure your session is productive. Okay. Clarifying, sometimes a client gives a lot of information all at once. And again, this is kind of like, if you want to think about this is kind of like focusing um, all at once that makes perfect sense to them, but can be confusing for the counselor to understand. So clarifying skill that uses the questions to help the counselor get better understanding of client's story. Okay. And this is when you're using clarifying, this is where you do what's called planned interruptions. Okay. We don't like doing this a lot. Um, um, but when stories start to get really confusing and really kind of directional. I used to use clarifying when a client couldn't really kind of stay on topic. So they might be starting with their relationship with their spouse and veer left and start talking about Aunt Gertrude and how she's never had a partner or whatever. And so I've used interruption to kind of say, now, well, hold on. I understand the story you're telling to me is important, but can we go back to the narrative or the story you were telling me about your relationship with your spouse? I understand that that can be a component of it, but I really need to have clarity on your story with you and your husband, irregardless of um, um, other things that are going on in your life. Okay. The reason why, and a lot of times individuals do this, is because of one of two reasons. One, they're uncomfortable with the story they're telling about their spouse. And so they'll veer off to another direction to avoid that. And when I say avoid it, psychologically avoid processing the rest of the original narrative that they were telling. But by you saying, we're going to walk through this, we're going to walk through what is the term? Walk through the valley of darkness together. Okay. Don't say that ever, please, but it's kind of the analogy. And you bring them back and say, hey, we weren't done with our journey here. I'm right here. I'm with you. And this is where I'm understanding we're going. Okay. And that allows the client to kind of keep with you. Now, going back to Isabel's example, quite a few times to kind of not simplify things, quite a few times the client will basically say, I'm not ready to continue talking about that. Um, and they'll outwardly say, I'm not ready for that journey. And so then you might just want to change topics and say, okay, well, we don't want to talk about this. Let's talk about your experience with something else, some other topic, one of the other three topics you got out of the first example. Okay. And so this isn't just a simple thing, oh, they'll go back with you and you'll walk through the valley of death together and kumbaya. No, a lot of times they'll say, I'm not ready to go there. And that's okay. That's not necessarily a reflection of your relationship with your client because they feel safe enough to tell you they don't want to go there. Okay. Um, what else? The second reason is they just don't know. They don't know where to go with their narrative. Maybe there's parts of the next part of their story that they can't remember or that they've avoided, and so they've forgotten. Um, they're not sure because it was a vague, maybe, if you're dealing with relationship violence and addiction. Maybe they had blackouts during that period due to the substances they were taking. So that in the other case, they may not even know the rest of the story. They may only have these little glimpses here and there. All right. And so in those cases, the first approach would be to clarify what has been said and say, well, when we began this conversation and then we went off onto a different route, and trying to help them build those memories back. Okay, from starting over and clarifying, doing some of that reflection, maybe that paraphrasing, and trying to just kind of get their mental capacity to remember what they can. Okay. If that doesn't work, then it's skipping to the present day. Let's say, for example, and you saying, well, let's talk about you and your spouse's relationship today. How is it going today? And then you try the backwards approach and work from today in reverse. So, oh, so you're doing well, you're communicating better. How is that different from a week ago or 2 weeks or in your past? What's the difference between now and your past? And work your way back. And again, going back to the example, they might say my relationship is horrid and we're almost about to get divorced. And then you're exactly that kind of gives you an understanding of why they're trying to forget parts of their experience with that individual. And you can work from there as well. Okay. So clarifying is used when your client is going off on different tangents and different ways. It's unlike focusing. Focusing is when you're getting a list of things that is just too much to handle within a session. Whereas clarifying is when the client is keeps kind of veering off into other areas. Okay. So the other skill, and I really think this one should probably be in the first section instead of this one here, because it's actually a skill that you'll utilize across situations. Okay. And it's one of the basic ways to clarify and understand your client. Now, this is an important statement, and I'm going to underline it. And this happens a lot. This happened a lot in the field of working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Okay. And I call this, when you're doing this, I call it social voyeurism. Okay. sometimes therapists will get into the habit of wanting to know the client's experience because the therapist wants to know. Okay. Um, and the best way to explain this is that everyone likes an interesting story and to know what happened to someone. Okay. That's one instance that you're just, instead of really helping the client, you yourself have curiosity about the story and what happened and the juiciness of it and all those other things. The other thing that we have to avoid when we're using questions is we're not there to interrogate the client. We're not there to find facts. We're not there to help, for example, law enforcement. Okay. We're not there to catch the client on something. Okay. And again, I saw this a lot working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, where the therapist themselves was playing like they were the police investigator and they were trying to figure out, is this person truly a victim, or are they the offender, or are they this or that? And that's wildly inappropriate. Okay. The other thing I have seen, and this is working in the field of addiction and trauma survivors, is sometimes the client, especially when the therapist, let me rewind back, the therapist had addiction issues in the past, or they had trauma issues in the past, such as domestic violence or sexual assault. Um, and um, and they do what's called countertransference, because they'll be listening to the story of addiction or the story of trauma, and it will remind them of what they went through. And I know this sounds odd, but they want to find a way to blame the client, even though they both may have been victims. They both may have went through addiction in a very unconscious way. And I'm not, and this isn't always a conscious thing that individuals do. In a very unconscious way, they want to be able to say that that victim deserved it. And so they go from being a counselor to interrogating the client and asking wildly inappropriate questions like, what were you dressing, for example? Why were you there in the first place? Were you doing any drugs? And now all of those very, very inappropriate questions when working with a survivor. Okay. And and in a lot of ways, when I've done supervision and it was recorded, and they watch it afterwards, and they realize what they were doing, they have a hard time with that. They can believe that they actually asked those wildly inappropriate questions. Okay. And this is one area where I'm going to say is, if you're going into a field where you have recovered from two, such as addiction, domestic violence, sexual violence, be aware of this and be very self-aware, especially when you're hearing clients tell you very similar things to you that you experience. That's when you need to do a self-check-in and do some self-awareness. Have a colleague or a mentor you can talk to. Okay. Because even though you may, for example, not had a drop of alcohol for 25 years, this still could be a triggering moment. Even though you've gone through a lot of trauma therapy and you've done a lot of healing, that doesn't mean that you can't be brought back into that situation. So I know I'm emphasizing this point a lot, but it happens, and I want you all to be aware that that can happen. Okay. So let's talk about just for a few minutes types of questions. You've probably all heard these terms. So closed-ended questions is when you either are eliciting a yes or no answer. Okay. So are you feeling sad today? That's basically yes or no. Versus saying something about how are you feeling today? Okay. And now if you think about this, these questions are both kind of can elicit a yes or no answer. Okay. Because if you think about it, I hear people, hey, how are you doing today? And you either say fine or it's been kind of crappy. Okay. Um, but and I think this example sucks on these open-ended questions. When they say, how are you feeling today? And they say, I'm fine, you can say something like, what does fine feel like to you? Okay. And so when you get those short, kind of closed answers, you can always use an open-ended question such as, what does fine look like to you? What does it feel like to you? And leaving that more even open-ended on those short answers. Okay. Always check in with yourself before asking a question to ensure that your reason for asking the question is in the client service and not, for example, and we just talked about this, satisfying your own curiosity. Okay. It's important to avoid things like why questions. Okay. Because why questions, according to research, especially, denotes some type of judgment. Why did you do that? Why did you enter that room? Why did you start for that drink? If you think about the way those questions sounded, they sounded very, very much judgmental in a way. And when you ask why questions, that's kind of what it elicits. And that's where you could get a lot of individuals to close up. Going back to Isabel's example, if you have a resistant client, never ask, why don't you say anything in the group? Why didn't you say anything during our session? It's tempting because it sounds natural to ask that why question. But going back to Isabel's question earlier in the class, you want to kind of avoid that, especially with resistant clients. Okay. And the last one we'll talk about today, and this goes back to paraphrasing. In fact, in some ways, I don't know why these are separated sometimes. But summarizing, this is a skill used to end a session, especially a group session. Okay. And it's effective. And I think the reason why this is used is it's a bit longer than a paraphrase. Okay. It's a useful way to reflect very key points in the session and bring a respectful close. Okay. So the way paraphrasing was used in the first part of the class is it's used as a tool to let your clients know you've been heard. Okay. When you're summarizing, this is the next component you add to that paraphrasing. Okay. Um, so in a summarizing uh, situation, you also include not only what the client stated, so that's the paraphrasing part, but also the skills that were talked about in the session and what you would like the clients to do the following week, whether it's implement one of the skills or do some type of homework or something like that. And reiterate when we come back next week, these are the things. So summarizing and paraphrasing are kind of one and the same. The paraphrasing is paraphrasing what the client's experience was during the session. And then adding this kind of summarizing thing is talking about the skills and everything that we went through today and what clients should work on through the following week. And so it's kind of this kind of combination of things that is added on with paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is just the short component, and then with full summarizing, again, you want to say, these are the skills we went over today and what we learned. I want you to try and implement these over the next week. Or often with cognitive behavioral therapy, they have some type of homework that they want the clients to do and bring back in the following week. And it's really this way to kind of end this session and really prepare the clients for the next section. Okay. Mm. I think we'll finish with immediacy today. Okay. So, what do you do when a client starts to get very defensive? Okay, maybe you're challenging them on a few things, or they're really starting to close down on you because we're talking about maybe their past or their experiences, and um, and you want to bring them back. Okay, this is where you want to use the skill of immediacy. Okay, and so maybe you're talking about stories or something where people were successful or unsuccessful with relapse prevention, for example. And you notice that the clients are starting to get very, very uncomfortable. You can say, you know what? Let's do this exercise for just a minute. What I want everyone to do is come back to the group and or come back to the session, and let's reflect on our feelings and emotions right here and now. Let's talk about what we're going. Let's leave. We're going to table the topic we were going to talk about. And I want everybody to come here in this place right now. Okay. You can even, this is where you can actually implement some mindfulness techniques where you have the clients, for example, close their eyes and either they're counting their breaths or um, um, having them do some type of, sometimes you can do some visual focus. So you can have, I want everybody to look at this poster on the wall, and I want you to focus on the poster. And once your mind starts to drift to things you need to do tomorrow or things you need to do after the group, or your mind starts, I want you to bring your mind back to that poster, or I want you to bring your attention back to counting your breaths. Okay, and bring them right here in this moment. All right. Because what these kind of do, so you can either do it directly and say, okay, wait, we're going to talk about what we're experiencing here and now. So let's come back to the group at this date and time, this place in this building, and let's talk about what we're experiencing here. Or you can do some of the mindfulness techniques to help individuals kind of recenter in the moment. Okay. What the goal is to help individuals realize what things are really affecting them. Okay. And it brings them back to going from a mindset of um, trauma, mindset of failures, a mindset of I can't do this, to a mindset that I'm here. And it actually kind of provides a moment of motivation to continue on, because you're recentering them and you're reattending to them that they're not at those places anymore. They're right here, they're safe, they're here, and this is where we need to be. Okay. And so immediacy is when you look at your group members and they start to withdraw, they start to close in, they stop talking, or in some cases, they're actually starting to get defensive in the way that they're starting to say, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I don't, this is nonsense, or all this therapy stuff is a whole bunch of crap. Those types of, and again, you will hear that. And this is where you can use the technique of immediacy to say, okay, Let's bring ourselves back together. Let's focus on the here and now. What are we experiencing right here and now? So that's the technique of immediacy. Okay. Which all these techniques work very well in a lot of situations, but they don't work well with all situations, especially with a group setting. So starting on Tuesday, and I've mentioned this time and time again, we're going to get into conflict resolution and how do you work with the very resistant client? So you've tried all these techniques, you've tried all these good counseling processes, but the client is still being resistant. They're still not wanting to be engaged. Or you're having group members that now, despite all your efforts using all these good counseling tools, you have group members that are still conflicting with each other or conflicting with you. How can we go beyond that and figure what additional techniques, I should say, can be utilized? Now, I do want to express this. Before you get into these resistant client techniques, these conflict resolution techniques, make sure you've attempted all of the other skills that we've talked about to this point. Make sure you kind of do that mental inventory and say, have I used immediacy? Have I used silence effectively? Have I used reflection effectively? And kind of do that mental rewind and make sure you've attempted all of those before you go on. Reason being is when you're dealing with conflict resolution and that continued resistant client, you're going to use more direct techniques. You're going to use ones that may have some in the beginning part may have some negative consequences on your relationship with your client. And so, and I don't want to emphasize that too much because sometimes you have to use these skills. But again, I'm just driving home the point. You want to use the skills that we've learned so far before we'll go into these that will start on Tuesday. Okay. So I'm going to hit stop sharing. I'm going to turn off our video.